The night over Henderson, Nevada settled like a heavy blanket, still and unmoving. The suburban neighborhood lay quiet beneath a pale moon, its cul-de-sacs and manicured lawns appearing almost serene from a distance. But serenity was an illusion, and in one house at the very end of a narrow street that illusion crumbled the closer one looked. From the outside, the house seemed ordinary, its faded beige siding and sagging porch railings blending into the uniformity of middle-class America. Yet a certain wrongness clung to it. The windows were covered with thick curtains drawn tight as if to keep something in or to keep others out. The yard, in contrast to the rest of the tidy neighborhood, lay neglected, brittle patches of grass broken by weeds, a rusted tricycle overturned near the fence, and a scattering of forgotten toys coated with dirt. Inside, there was only darkness. The air was stale, unmoving. Somewhere deep within the house, faint mechanical humming broke the silence, followed by a sound more unsettling, the muffled rhythm of a soft broken tune hummed by someone too weary to remember the words. Then came the metallic scrape of a bolt sliding, followed by a click, another and another, 4 in total. 4 locks securing a single door. Beyond that door, the room was barely a room at all. A single bulb swung from a frayed wire, overhead its light flickering as if in hesitation. The walls bore stains of neglect and despair. In the far corner sat a crude handmade structure, a cage assembled from mismatched wooden beams and lengths of wire mesh reinforced with screws and bolts that had been drilled directly into the floor. It was no accident, no temporary restraint. It had been built with purpose. Inside the cage was a boy. 11 years old, frail, his small frame curled into itself as if trying to disappear. His skin was pale, stretched thin over sharp bones, and his dark hair hung in uneven tangles around his face. He wore only a soiled t-shirt and an oversized diaper, sagging with discomfort. His thin arms clutched a stuffed bear, so worn it seemed barely whole one ear, missing the fabric matted and threadbare. The boy's name was Caleb Foster. Caleb did not cry. He had long ago forgotten how. He did not call out, for he had learned that no one came when he did. His wide, dark eyes stared upward toward the flickering bulb, unblinking, his expression vacant, yet somehow heavy with secrets no child should carry. Occasionally, his gaze drifted to the small camera mounted high in the corner of the room. It whirred softly as it tracked his movement, its red light glowing like an unfeeling sentinel. In that house, silence had weight. It pressed against the walls, filled the air, and suffocated everything beneath it. Not far away, while Caleb remained unseen and unheard, another kind of silence unfolded in the halls of Sunrise Elementary School. There, Margaret Jensen, known to everyone simply as Maggie, sat at her cluttered desk, sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee while she logged into the attendance dashboard on her aging computer. Maggie was 46 with tired but observant eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses. She had worked at Sunrise Elementary for 17 years, moving through its halls like an anchor in the steady current of children coming and going. She was not a loud woman, nor one prone to dramatics, but she was deeply committed to the quiet task of noticing. To Maggie, attendance was never just about numbers. Each mark on her spreadsheet represented a child, a life, a fragile thread connecting home and school. She had learned through experience and heartbreak that a sudden absence could mean much more than a simple stomach bug or family vacation. Sometimes it meant a child had slipped beneath the surface unseen. This morning, one name stared back at her stark against the screen: Caleb Foster, absent, unexcused, for the 3rd day in a row. Maggie frowned, tapping her pen against the desk. Caleb's file was thin, his recent transfer leaving gaps in the record. She remembered him clearly, though a quiet boy with deep, unreadable eyes. He rarely made eye contact, never spoke, and often seemed lost in a world of his own. Once, months ago, Maggie had seen him draw a small red door in the corner of a worksheet. It had struck her as odd, haunting, even though she couldn't explain why. Now, as she stared at his name on the screen, unease stirred inside her. No calls from his father, no email from home, no explanation at all. 3 consecutive days without a word. In her experience, this was never a good sign. She glanced out of the office window toward the empty playground bathed in pale winter sunlight. Somewhere a bell rang and children's voices echoed faintly down the hall. The world went on as usual, oblivious to what might be happening behind closed doors. 3 days, Maggie murmured to herself. Too long. Little did she know, on that same quiet morning, Caleb sat in darkness just a few miles away, clutching his bear and humming a tune no one would ever hear. And outside his locked door, no one had yet come to knock. If you're moved by true stories that matter, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us as we follow Caleb's journey, a story that will challenge everything you think you know about safety, silence, and the power of one person paying attention. The next morning dawned bright and cool over Henderson, Nevada. Children tumbled from minivans and yellow buses, their backpacks bouncing, their laughter ringing out across the school parking lot. It was the kind of morning that should have felt ordinary, full of small rituals and predictable rhythms. But to Maggie Jensen, something was wrong. From her desk in the front office, Maggie listened to the ebb and flow of the school day. Phones rang, announcements played over the intercom, the faint clatter of pencils and chatter of voices blending into a familiar background symphony. Yet, beneath it all, there was a note of discord she couldn't quite name. Caleb Foster's name still glared at her from the attendance list. Absent again. No call, no email, no note. It was the 4th day now, and the silence surrounding his absence was beginning to feel ominous. Maggie had seen this pattern before. Children didn't just vanish without reason. They faded, gradually slipping through cracks so narrow no one else noticed until it was too late. A late assignment here, a missed day there, until one day a desk sat empty and stayed that way. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, then fell into her lap. It wasn't enough to just mark Caleb absent and move on. She needed to understand why. She picked up the phone and dialed the number listed for Arthur Foster, Caleb's father. The line rang 5 times before an automated voice informed her that the voicemail box was full. She tried again at lunchtime, then once more after the final bell. Each time, nothing. No answer. By late afternoon, unease had settled deep in Maggie's chest like a weight. She stared at Caleb's thin paper file, its pages offering only the barest outline of his life. Recent transfer from another district. Special education placement for nonverbal autism. Emergency contacts. Arthur Foster listed first, then a woman named Martha Foster as secondary. No grandparents, no aunts or uncles, no one else. Maggie's thoughts flickered to the boy himself. She remembered the way he had sat during class visits perfectly still, except for his fingers twisting a piece of string. She remembered the one time he had looked up at her fleetingly before turning back inward. There had been something in his eyes and something lonely, something closed off like a house with all its windows shuttered. Now those windows seemed sealed tighter than ever. The school day ended, but Maggie didn't go home. Instead, she locked up the office, grabbed her worn leather tote bag, and slid behind the wheel of her aging sedan. The decision to drive to Caleb's house felt inevitable, as if she'd been heading there all along without realizing it. The neighborhood lay on the older side of town, a cluster of modest single-story homes built decades ago. Most were well kept with neatly trimmed hedges and welcome mats at the front doors. But as Maggie turned onto the narrow cul-de-sac, one house immediately drew her attention. It was the kind of house you could overlook at first glance, then remember later with a prickle at the back of your neck. Its blinds were drawn tight despite the cheerful afternoon sun. The lawn was patchy, the grass brittle and yellow. A swing set stood in the yard, its chains rusted, one seat missing entirely. Maggie parked at the curb and sat for a moment, engine idling. A sense of stillness hung over the property, too heavy to be natural. She approached the front door and rang the bell. No answer. She knocked firmly, the practiced rhythm of someone used to making herself heard. Still nothing. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Maggie knocked again, louder this time. She thought she heard a faint sound from within, a shuffle of movement perhaps, or a television turned low, but it could have been her imagination. Circling to the side of the house, she peered through a gap in the wooden fence. The backyard offered no more reassurance. A broken tricycle lay on its side near the steps, its wheels bent. A pile of old plywood leaned haphazardly against the exterior wall. No children's laughter, no barking dog, no signs of life at all. She returned to the front and was about to knock once more when the door opened a crack. Arthur Foster stood there unshaven, his eyes shadowed. His broad shoulders filled the doorway like a barrier. Yes? His voice was curt, defensive. Maggie forced her tone to remain calm and professional. "Good afternoon, Mr. Foster. I'm Maggie Jensen from Sunrise Elementary. Caleb's been absent for several days now, and I wanted to check in." Arthur shifted his gaze, darting past her to the street as if scanning for witnesses. "He's sick. Acting out. We're keeping him home until he settles. Has he seen a doctor?" "No need. It's behavioral. Would it be possible for me to speak with him just to say hello?" Arthur's jaw tightened. "He's resting. It's better if he stays quiet." Behind him, Maggie caught a fleeting glimpse of Martha Foster, a pale figure standing in the dim hallway. Martha's eyes met hers for a heartbeat wide and pleading before she retreated out of sight. The smell of ammonia drifted faintly from the darkness beyond Arthur's shoulder. It prickled at Maggie's senses, stirring memories of hospital wards and locked janitorial closets. Something was terribly wrong here. She stepped back slightly, keeping her voice even. "Mr. Foster, school policy requires us to follow up after extended absences. If I don't see Caleb today, I'll have to report it." Arthur's expression hardened. "You think we're hurting him?" Maggie didn't answer directly. "If everything is fine, this will be quick." There was a long, heavy pause. Then Arthur said flatly, "You'll need to come back later. My wife isn't home." And with that, he closed the door. Not slammed, just slowly, deliberately, like sealing something inside. Maggie stood motionless on the porch, staring at the worn welcome mat at her feet. The silence on the other side of the door seemed to hum like a live wire. Her mind was made up. She pulled out her phone and dialed the school counselor. Her voice when she spoke was low and urgent. "I need someone to call Child Protective Services. Now. If this story unsettles you, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss what comes next." Caleb's story has only just begun, and the truth waiting behind that door is darker than you can imagine. The sun was sliding lower in the Nevada sky by the time the patrol car arrived, its headlights briefly catching the dull reflection of the house's windows. Maggie stood on the sidewalk a few feet away, arms crossed tightly against the chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. She had been there for nearly half an hour, already pacing, watching, waiting. The neighborhood had begun to notice. Curtains shifted in nearby homes, faces peered out for a moment, then vanished again. No one stepped outside. That Maggie thought grimly was the problem with silence. People saw, people suspected, but few ever acted. The patrol car door opened and two uniformed officers emerged. Officer Ramirez, tall and steady, carried himself with calm authority. Beside him, Officer Cole, younger and sharper, scanned the area with alert eyes. Ms. Jensen Ramirez asked, approaching her. "Yes," Maggie said, her voice clipped with tension. "That's the house. Caleb Foster hasn't been to school in 4 days. I came by earlier. His father wouldn't let me see him." Ramirez nodded. "We'll handle it. Why don't you stay back while we speak to the residents?" Maggie hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her not to let them go in alone, but she stepped back to the curb. From there she could see the front door clearly. Her hands clenched tightly at her sides. Ramirez knocked firmly 3 sharp raps. Inside, silence stretched thin. Finally, footsteps approached. The door opened and Arthur Foster filled the frame once again, his expression wary. "Evening." Sir Ramirez began, his tone professional and neutral. "We received a call about your son, Caleb. We'd like to confirm he's safe." "He's fine," Arthur said quickly. "Just sick. Not in the mood for people." Ramirez's gaze remained steady. "We understand, but we need to confirm that in person. It won't take long." Arthur's eyes flicked past the officer to Maggie, who stood rigid and unflinching on the sidewalk. Something hard flashed in his face. "She sent you," he muttered. "She filed a welfare concern, yes," Ramirez replied evenly. "Sir, if everything is fine, this will be quick. Arthur exhaled sharply through his nose. "He gets violent sometimes. He's autistic. You don't understand what it's like." "Then you understand our position," Ramirez said calmly. "We need to see him for ourselves." For a moment it seemed Arthur might refuse outright. His hands twitched at his sides, fingers curling into fists. Then, with visible effort, he stepped back. "Fine, but don't upset him." The smell hit them almost immediately. At first it was subtle, just a hint of something sour in the air. With each step deeper into the house it thickened, ammonia sweat decay. Maggie covered her mouth, fighting the urge to gag. The hallway was narrow, lined with old family photos. Many of the frames were cracked, the glass splintered as if struck. The walls bore smudges and faded stains. Arthur walked ahead of them, stiff-backed. Ramirez's gaze swept the hallway, noting every detail. "Where is Caleb's room?" At the end, Arthur said. As they neared the final door, Maggie's breath caught. Something about it was wrong. Unlike the others, this door was reinforced with a metal plate and 4 heavy padlocks, each a different brand, clamped in place. Ramirez halted, his eyes narrowing. "Sir, what is this?" Arthur shifted uncomfortably. "We had to modify it. For safety." Officer Cole stepped closer, examining the locks. "Modified? This looks like a cell." "It's not," Arthur said quickly. "Caleb broke through the old door once. This keeps him in, keeps the rest of us safe." Ramirez's tone hardened. "Mr. Foster, unlock it, now." Arthur didn't move. His jaw flexed, his breathing uneven. "He's not in danger. Unlock it," Ramirez's repeated voice sharp. Slowly, grudgingly, Arthur turned and disappeared into the kitchen. He returned moments later with a small key ring. The first lock opened with a loud click, then the second. The sound echoed down the hallway, each metallic snap raising the tension higher. By the third lock, Maggie's pulse was pounding in her ears. The fourth lock gave way. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then Ramirez reached forward and pushed the door open. The smell that rushed out was overwhelming, a wave of rot and unwashed filth. Maggie stumbled back, gagging behind her hand. Inside the room was dim and windowless, lit only by a single bulb that flickered overhead. The air was thick, humid, oppressive. The walls bore streaks of something dark and dried. And in the far corner, like a cruel joke, stood a cage. It was crudely built from mismatched wood and wire mesh bolted directly to the floor and wall so it couldn't be moved. This wasn't a temporary measure. It had been here a long, long time. Inside the cage was Caleb Foster. He was curled tightly into himself, shirtless, his knees drawn to his chest. His skin was shockingly pale, his limbs thin and bruised. The only things in the cage besides Caleb were a stained blanket, a dented plastic cup, and the ragged stuffed bear clutched in his arms. For a moment, everyone froze. The horror of the scene was so complete, so wrong, that it seemed unreal. Then Caleb's head lifted. His eyes, wide and dark, locked onto Maggie. His lips moved. No sound emerged at first. Then, barely audible, a whisper, "Maggie." The world seemed to stop. Maggie dropped to her knees, tears burning her eyes. "Sweetheart," she breathed, voice breaking. "I'm here." Caleb didn't cry. He simply stared at her, his expression hollow, as if unsure whether she was real. Ramirez turned sharply to Cole. "Get EMS now, and call Child Protective. This kid is coming out of here." As Cole moved to make the calls, Ramirez stepped forward, pulling the cage door open with a screech of protesting metal. Caleb flinched but didn't resist as Ramirez lifted him carefully into his arms. The boy weighed almost nothing. Behind them, Arthur suddenly lunged forward. "You don't understand," he shouted, his voice raw. "He's dangerous. He killed her." Ramirez, and Cole restrained him swiftly, forcing him back toward the hallway. Outside, neighbors had gathered silently, drawn by the flashing lights and raised voices. They stood at a distance, pale and wide-eyed, whispering among themselves. Maggie followed as Caleb was carried out into the cool evening air. She reached for his hand, holding it gently in hers. The sight of the boy in the ambulance, small silent eyes staring into nothing, seared itself into her memory. Arthur was shoved into the back of a police car, still shouting incoherently. "She's dead because of him. You'll see. You'll all see," as the sirens wailed and the vehicles pulled away. Maggie remained standing in the street, trembling. What she had witnessed would haunt her forever. If you believe no child should ever suffer unseen, subscribe now and stay with us. Caleb's story is far from over, and what comes next will leave you breathless. The night after Caleb's rescue was restless and cold. Henderson Memorial Hospital glowed faintly against the darkness, its sterile corridors a stark contrast to the place where Caleb had been found. Maggie sat in a hard plastic chair outside the pediatric trauma unit, her cardigan pulled tightly around her shoulders. Through the small observation window, she could see him lying in a hospital bed swaddled in thin white blankets. He looked even smaller now, dwarfed by the machines that beeped and hummed softly around him. Caleb did not speak. He did not even cry. His eyes remained open, staring blankly at the ceiling as though the world beyond it no longer held meaning. A nurse tried to coax the stuffed bear from his arms to clean it, but he clutched it tighter, a silent, stubborn act of possession. It was the only thing in his life no one had managed to take from him. Maggie pressed her hand to the glass, a lump forming in her throat. She had seen neglected children before, but never anything like this. Caleb's silence wasn't simply the absence of words. It was the silence of someone who had been erased piece by piece. While doctors examined, Caleb detectives began their own work peeling back the layers of the foster family's past. Each discovery painted a darker picture than the last. Years earlier, before the locks, before the cage, there had been another version of this family. Back then, Arthur Foster had been a man with a modest job and an ordinary life. His wife Grace was the kind of woman whose laughter filled a room. Grace had adored Caleb from the moment he was born. She understood his differences and met them with unwavering patience. She fought for early intervention speech therapy, special education support, anything that might help her son find his place in a world that wasn't built for him. Arthur, however, had struggled. At first he tried. He sat through appointments, nodded as therapists explained techniques, pretended to believe they could make progress. But privately, resentment festered. Caleb's milestones never came. There were no first words, no spontaneous hugs, no "I love you, Dad." Instead, there were sleepless nights filled with Caleb's screams, walls smeared with food or worse, and neighbors who gave pitying looks but never offered to help. Arthur began working longer hours to escape the house. Grace became the center of Caleb's world while Arthur drifted further to the margins. Then came the rainy night that changed everything. Grace was driving home with Caleb in the back seat when the car skidded on a slick curve. The crash was sudden and violent. Grace died instantly. Caleb survived without major injuries, but the look on his face when Arthur arrived at the hospital would haunt the man forever. Arthur's grief was immediate, overwhelming, and twisted. Somewhere deep inside, grief turned to blame. Caleb had been there. Caleb had screamed in the car moments before it spun out of control. In Arthur's mind, those screams became the cause of the unforgivable mistake. "He killed her," Arthur whispered to himself in the weeks that followed, and the more he repeated it, the more it felt like truth. With Grace gone, Arthur was alone with a child he didn't understand and increasingly resented. His coping skills eroded. Bills piled up. The house fell into disrepair. Caleb, too young to comprehend any of it, retreated further into himself. It was during this unraveling that Martha entered Arthur's life. She worked at a local urgent care clinic where Arthur sought treatment for a broken hand and injury sustained during one of Caleb's violent outbursts. Martha had warm eyes and a tired smile. She was divorced, childless, and lonely in a way that recognized the same loneliness in others. Their relationship began quietly. Coffee dates, simple dinners. Within a year, she moved in. At first, Martha tried. She read books about autism. She sat with Caleb rolling a toy truck back and forth, hoping he might join the game. She prepared meals he might eat. But Caleb never responded, never reached back. And Arthur, rather than encouraging her, mocked her efforts. "You'll see," he said coldly. He's broken. Martha's hope withered. Over time, she stopped trying. When Caleb began escaping his room at night, Arthur's frustration boiled over. The first lock went on the door, then another. When Caleb clawed his way out, Arthur built the cage. Layer by layer, he created the prison that would one day horrify the world. Martha watched it all in silence, paralyzed by fear and guilt. But one night, after Caleb scraped his arms raw, trying to climb out, she broke. She sat at the old family computer, tears falling onto the keyboard, and typed an email. It was addressed to the school district. "I don't know who to speak to. My stepson is in danger. My husband is doing things I can't explain. Please, someone check on him before it's too late." She hovered over the send button for a long time before finally clicking it, and then nothing happened. The message slipped into an inbox that no one checked. The administrative account was in transition after a staff retirement, and the email was buried beneath dozens of others. It remained there for nearly 2 years, unopened, unread, forgotten. Martha waited for someone to come. No one did. Eventually, she stopped waiting. She folded into silence, becoming part of the machinery of neglect. Now, as Caleb lay recovering in a hospital bed and Arthur sat in a police interrogation room, that old email had finally surfaced. Its timestamp was a damning reminder of how many people had failed him, not just his family, but an entire system built to protect children like him. If you want to hear how justice will be fought for Caleb, subscribe to our channel and stay with us. The next chapter reveals the fight to hold everyone accountable. The courthouse in downtown Henderson was an imposing building of pale stone and narrow windows, its architecture cold and unyielding. On the morning of the preliminary hearing, a gray sky hung low overhead, pressing down on the crowd that had gathered outside. There were no protest signs, no shouting. Just clusters of neighbors, reporters, and quiet onlookers drawn by curiosity and unease. The air buzzed with whispers and the hum of live-streaming equipment as local news stations prepared to broadcast updates. Maggie Jensen stood at the base of the courthouse steps, her hands clasped tightly together. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back, her face bare of makeup. She had come not to make statements or to be seen, but to bear witness. Beside her stood Dorothy Hayes, the neighbor who had lived next door to the Fosters for decades. Dorothy clutched a manila folder to her chest, its contents nothing more than scribbled notes and memories she wished she'd acted on sooner. Inside the courtroom was stark and solemn. Pale wood paneling rows of benches half filled with spectators and a single American flag hanging behind the judge's bench. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with anticipation. When Arthur Foster was led in, the room shifted. He looked thinner than the day of his arrest, his once intimidating presence diminished by the orange jumpsuit and the cuffs on his wrists. His eyes, however, were as sharp and dangerous as ever. He scanned the room briefly, his gaze sliding past Maggie, past Dorothy, past Martha before settling on the floor in front of him. Martha sat 2 rows behind the prosecution table, her posture rigid, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her hair was pulled back, and though her face was pale, her expression was steady. She had made a choice to speak, to no longer hide, and that choice would cost her everything. The proceedings began with the prosecutor laying out the case. Photographs of the cage were displayed on a projection screen, each image met with audible gasps from the gallery. One photo showed the rusted metal bars bolted to the floor. Another, Caleb's thin body curled in a corner clutching the ragged stuffed bear. "These images are difficult to look at," the prosecutor said, his voice measured but firm. "But they are necessary. They represent the reality of what this child endured, not for days, not for weeks, but for years." Maggie's stomach twisted. She had seen the cage in person, smelled the stench of that room, yet the photographs somehow felt worse. There was no escaping the stillness of a picture. The prosecutor continued calling witnesses one by one. A pediatric specialist testified to Caleb's physical condition, severe malnutrition, chronic infections, bruises consistent with long-term confinement. A child psychologist described the lasting effects of sensory deprivation and trauma. When Martha took the stand, the room fell silent. She spoke haltingly at first, then with growing strength as she described the years of escalating control and fear. "I told myself it was temporary," she said, her voice breaking. "That Arthur was doing what he thought was best, that maybe I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew. I knew it was wrong, and I did nothing." She paused, clutching a tissue in her trembling hands. "I even sent an email once to the school district. I begged for help. No one ever came." Maggie closed her eyes, the words cutting deep. She had seen that email now, time-stamped and unopened, and she knew the weight of that failure would never fully leave her. The defense attorney tried to paint a different picture. He described Arthur as an overwhelmed father, a man struggling with grief after losing his wife, doing the best he could for a child with profound needs. He called the cage a safety enclosure meant to prevent Caleb from harming himself or others. Arthur sat impassive. His jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance. But the turning point came when the prosecutor introduced the USB drive. "This," he said, holding up the small device, "was recovered from the foster home, thanks to Mrs. Foster's cooperation. It contains video evidence that goes beyond neglect. It reveals intent." The lights dimmed as the first video played. The footage was grainy, captured by a hidden camera in the hallway outside Caleb's room. Arthur's voice filled the courtroom, low and venomous. "You don't deserve a second chance," he hissed off screen. "You killed her. You knew she was tired and you screamed anyway. She crashed because of you." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Maggie's hands flew to her mouth. The next clip showed Caleb inside the cage, rocking back and forth, humming softly. Arthur stood over him, arms crossed, cold and unyielding. "You don't get to cry," he said. "Crying is for kids with a future." When the video ended, silence fell like a heavy curtain. Even the defense attorney seemed momentarily stunned. Then came a sound no one expected. A small, fragile voice broke the stillness. "Maggie." Heads turned. Caleb sat beside a social worker near the front row. Until this moment, he had been silent, eyes downcast, hands gripping his beer. Now he looked up, his lips forming a single trembling word. "Out," he whispered. The word was soft, but it carried through the courtroom like a bell. Maggie's vision blurred with tears. For weeks, Caleb had been silent, trapped inside himself just as surely as he had been trapped in that cage. Now, in front of strangers, he had spoken not a plea, not a scream, but a choice. The judge's gavel struck sharply, breaking the spell. Order was restored, but nothing would ever be the same. The prosecutor turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is not just a case of a father who made mistakes. This is deliberate cruelty. This is psychological torture, and it ends here." The verdict was swift. Arthur Foster was found guilty on all counts: felony child endangerment, unlawful confinement, and emotional abuse. When the judge pronounced the sentence 16 years in prison with no possibility of parole before 12, Arthur showed no reaction. He simply stared straight ahead, his face a mask of bitter silence. Martha bowed her head. Dorothy wept quietly. Maggie reached for Caleb's hand and held it, feeling the slight squeeze of his tiny fingers in return. Outside the courthouse, the gray clouds had parted, revealing a patch of pale blue sky. "Justice has been served," the narrator intoned softly. "But the journey is not over. If you followed Caleb's story, subscribe now to stay with us. The final chapter will show how healing begins." The weeks that followed the trial moved slowly like a winter thaw, reluctant to surrender to spring. Henderson Memorial discharged Caleb into the care of a specialized therapy center in nearby Spring Valley. It wasn't an impressive building, just a one-story structure surrounded by gravel and a few desert trees, but inside, the walls were painted in bright, hopeful colors. The air smelled faintly of lavender oil and construction paper, a deliberate contrast to the darkness Caleb had known for so long. Maggie visited as often as she could. The first time she walked through the door, she found Caleb sitting at a low table, a stack of clean white paper before him, crayons neatly arranged in a careful row. He didn't look up when she entered, but he nudged an empty chair outward with his foot. An invitation, simple and profound. "Hi, sweetheart," she said softly, taking the seat beside him. Caleb picked up a red crayon and began to draw. His movements were deliberate, slow, as though each line required great thought. A square took shape on the page, then a small figure inside it, then another figure standing just outside, taller arms extended. Finally, he drew a door wide open. Maggie's breath caught. "Is that me?" Caleb didn't speak, but he slid the red crayon toward her. She picked it up with trembling fingers and added a sun in the corner of the page, a simple circle with radiating lines. When she finished, Caleb reached for a yellow crayon and drew another sun beside hers. 2 suns side by side, one red, one yellow. He looked at her, then really looked, his dark eyes alive in a way they hadn't been before. Healing, Maggie thought, was never sudden. It came in fragments, one whispered word, one shared, drawing one moment of connection. Across town, Martha sat at a small table in a women's shelter, writing a letter in neat, careful cursive. She knew Caleb might never read it, and even if he did, forgiveness was not guaranteed. "Dear Caleb," she wrote, "I don't ask you to forgive me. I only want you to know that I see you now. I hear you. I failed you once, but I will not be silent again. Not in memory, not in action. Whatever time I have left, I will spend speaking for you, for every child whose voice has been taken away." When she sealed the envelope, her hands were steady for the first time in years. Back at the therapy center, Maggie watched as Caleb added the final touches to his drawing. She thought of the unopened email, the locks on the door, the neighbors who had looked away. So many chances to act, all missed. But not anymore. She pinned Caleb's drawing to the bulletin board at Sunrise Elementary, right beside the class photo where his seat still sat empty. Not forever, she promised herself. One day, that seat would be filled again. "Some days need more light," Caleb had said, once his voice barely above a whisper. 2 suns. 2 chances. Maggie turned to the camera, her voice calm but urgent. "Thank you for walking with us through Caleb's story. If you believe no child should suffer unseen, subscribe to our channel and share this story." Somewhere, right now, another door is locked, another voice is silent. Maybe yours is the voice that will open it. The screen faded to black, leaving only the drawing of 2 suns glowing softly side by side.